Actually, let me make sure Sarah's set up. Maybe it's just switching.
Oh, no, it's
And you have your notes? Ready?
Yep.
Okay, great. So yes, I'd like to introduce Sarah Friend and her talk, Decentralization and its Discontents. Please welcome her.
Thanks, everybody. Hello, hello. Is this on? Am I loud enough? Okay. So hi, like Sarah just said, my name is also Sarah. I'm an artist and software engineer. I work in the blockchain space. And I'm also a co-organizer of a conference called Our Networks on all aspects of the distributed web. And some of my co-organizers are here in the audience. Gary has an art piece outside, and Ben did a workshop yesterday. So this presentation is going to be kind of trying to problematize a lot of things about the decentralization movement. And I work in the blockchain space, so a lot of my examples are going to be from blockchain, but I hope that they can be relevant to whatever aspect of this you may work in. So first, what is the decentralization movement? This is a totally not comprehensive overview of what's going on. There are tools being worked on at really every layer of the stack, from network layer with mesh networks to data layer, protocol development, things like ipfs and blockchains, application layer, things like Beaker browser, dApps, and then finally this sort of human layer of governance with tools like Lumio and things like DAOs. This is our agenda for the talk. And this presentation is going to be a bit of an experiment because it's really just framed as a bunch of questions. And it's pretty low on answers to those questions. When I set out to start to dig into some of the things I felt were under-discussed in the decentralization movement, I realized that the questions are more interesting to me than trying to solve them right away. So first off, we're going to talk about what is decentralization. Are we sure that we know? Do we want decentralization? Let's not assume that we do. And then finally, are there limits to decentralization? Because it may turn out that there are. So first off, what is decentralization? Turns out more complicated than you may think. This is not an explanation. So the first thing to note about the word decentralization, and I'm not the first person to point this out, is that what this word really means is just not centralization. And there's a word for this type of definition. It's an antonymic definition. But the problem with an antonymic definition is that we have this thing that we can point at that's centralization, but what are all these other things that aren't centralization but aren't the same thing? Are they all lumped under the same word? If you look at the origin of the term, it actually comes from the French Revolution in the mid-1800s. So Alex de Tocqueville wrote that the French Revolution began with a push towards decentralization, but became, in the end, an extension of centralization. Which really reminded me of this Hannah Arendt passage, which is, the most radical revolutionary will become a conservative the day after the revolution. And indeed, decentralization is still more often used in a political or organizational context than a technical one. After I came up with the title for this talk, I realized there's a book with the same title, and its subtitle is called An Essay on Class, Political Agency, and National Perspective in Indonesian Politics. The Google definitions that come up are the transfer of authority from central to local government, and the movement of departments of a large organization away from a single administrative center to other locations. So yeah, both of these are political organizational definitions. And I think there's some irony to be noted here, because many of us who are part of the decentralized web movement are in these communities that have loose, intransparent, if any, governance structures. And it's also worth noting off the bat that even in the political and organizational context, the concept of decentralization has been a component of many political movements, some very at odds with one another. So there's a free market rationale for decentralization. This passage is from an article about information markets. The sentence before it cites Adam Smith. The sentence after it cites Friedrich von Hayek. And it characterizes a free market as by nature decentralized because it's the movement of these rational actors who are going about independently creating wealth in their nations without some kind of centralized coordinating. But there's also an entire movement called Decentralized Socialism. And this is a passage talking about how Mao Zedong was practicing it and reacting to the centralization of Soviet Russia. So really a dizzying array of thinkers have called for some kind of decentralization. And of course, that's what's interesting about the idea. It's kind of like universal basic income in that it has this really astonishing cross-partisan support, which lends it a certain gravitational pull. Untangling it is compelling. So sometimes people say it's more accurate to talk about re-decentralizing the web, and that the internet once was decentralized. This may very well be the case, but let's talk about one example, which is Arpanet, predecessor to the World Wide Web we know today, a network funded by the Department of Defense. This is a map of its early state. The first 4 nodes were at UCLA, Stanford, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. So these were elite universities. I would not describe this as an open access network. And indeed, all of the early Arpanet nodes were at universities or large technology companies. Maybe you could say this is decentralized geographically to some extent, but I see large clusters around the coasts and Middle America kind of left out here. And it was hardly decentralized amongst social classes. So to complicate things more, the development of Arpanet was, to some extent, motivated by the desire to have networks that could withstand catastrophic partitioning. This is something that we still often discuss in the decentralization movement, but this was with a Cold War military motivation, namely to create a network that could survive a nuclear war. And there are somewhat contradictory quotes from this time. You know, some people saying that this was a motivation, some people that it was a motivation for other work, but not specifically Arpanet. But nonetheless, it was a military-funded project. And these arguments about surviving massive segmentation are ones we hear even now in favor of decentralization, like in the case of a natural disaster. But do we feel the same way about them when they're being used to protect the military interests of a nation state? And of course, Arpanet was only one form of the early internet. We could probably argue that something like Usenet was way more decentralized, but coming from the lens of problematizing decentralization, I think Arpanet is the most interesting example. All right, so we may not be sure what decentralization is, but can we measure it? This is one way that people like to try a lot. It's a set of things called the Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient. And they're most often used to measure the decentralization of wealth. So there are a few components going on in this graph. We have this 45-degree straight line of equality, and that is the curve that we would get if wealth distribution were totally uniform. So that would be if 10% of the population had 10% of the wealth, 50% of the population had 50%, et cetera, et cetera. And the Lorenz curve is what we get when we plot the actuals, and it's, spoiler, usually pretty far away. And the Gini coefficient is another name for the same sort of measurement. It represents the difference between the actuals and this line of perfect equality. So this is from an excellent recent article called Quantifying Decentralization by Balaji Srinivasan. And he takes the top 100 cryptocurrencies and he plots the Lorenz curve of them. And we will see some pretty intense inequality. So again, from Quantifying Decentralization, he describes a decentralized system is really made up of these many subsets of different decentralized systems. So in the case of a project like Bitcoin, it's really made up of miners, exchanges, nodes, developers, different client implementations, et cetera. And all of these things can be more or less decentralized. So I think it may be helpful here to borrow the term intersectional and to think about intersectional decentralization. And so if we imagine decentralization instead as these intersecting subsets of different decentralizations, like geographical, architectural, governance, demographic, etc., and none of these really make sense to consider in the absence of the others, we only arrive at the complete picture by considering their interrelatedness. All right, so do we want decentralization? I think this deserves to be an open question, or at least one we don't forget it's possible to ask. And if we accept that there's no one canonical decentralization, and that maybe there's no way to have all possible decentralizations, which decentralization do we want? So first off, do people want decentralization? This is from a recent post by Tony Shang. He looks at a variety of papers, and he assesses the word quantity of decentralized and decentralization. So it does indicate, a surge in recent interest. The Bitcoin white paper had the word, did not include the word at all, and then we see it appearing really regularly in these more recent papers. And I got interested in whether this showed up on the macro internet, so I did a bunch of Google Trends searching, and it turns out that when you look for the word decentralized, you do see this uptick in recent interest. So, it does maybe seem that there is growing interest in this concept. Maybe we do want decentralization, but let's consider a possible pitfall or a reason we may not. This is the ENS, if you don't know, is a decentralized name service running on the Ethereum network. And this is a Twitter bot that tweets out when domain names are bought. So what this tweet is saying is that stormfront.eth was registered in July 2017. And Daily Stormer was also registered a couple months earlier. And this date and tweet is significant because this is just several weeks before the coordinated effort of GoDaddy, Google, CloudFront, and a company called Network Solutions to cancel the accounts of these sites. And this was a very controversial event, made a lot of headlines. Cloudflare published a blog post explaining both their reasons for acting, as well as the reasons it's dangerous to do so, which came back to decentralization, citing the increasing dependence on a few giant networks as one of these dangers. And the first sentence here illustrates really quite succinctly one of the problems with centralization. Our terms of service reserve the right for us to terminate users of our networks at our sole discretion. But of course, this specific action on the part of these companies was very popular. So without making any arguments necessarily in favor or against of what these companies did, I would simply suggest that to be in favor of this action and simultaneously in favor of a perfectly censorship-resistant DNS is logically inconsistent. This is a related example. It's a Twitter bot that tracks the trading activities of known or suspected neo-Nazis. Turns out a lot of them use Bitcoin. And here's another example of a way that a decentralized network can be used to host content that may be repugnant to its users. This poll is asking, would you stop running your blockchain node if you found out that there's child porn in it? 31% said no, but a solid 15% said yes. And the reason I bring this up is not really to ask about any of these specific examples, though certainly each deserves consideration, but to instead ask, is there anything that could be done, could be in the blockchain, or perhaps on your ipfs node, that would stop you from hosting that node? Is there X such that you would stop participating in the network? And if the answer to that question is yes, and I think it's a question worth asking, we should ask it with the understanding that the system we are already using contains implicit answers to it in its governance or in its lack thereof. So we could argue perhaps that forking the network is a sort of free market approach to this type of governance. If we don't like the things in the network, we can fork it, we can make a new chain. We could describe, the variety of altcoins out there as this marketplace of competing implementations and governance practices. And I think that may be a valid argument. But if we're going to posit this as the solution to a lack of governance in our communities, then I think as developers we need to get a little more serious about planning for things like contentious hard forks. and possibly moving our application between chains, between different decentralization protocols. Do we need a protocol for forks? All right, so we may not all want decentralization for the same reason. And I can't take credit for this caption, but I also don't want to dox its creator. So I'll let you interpret this phenomenon, which is certainly the case that the decentralization movement contains many competing motivations. It could be either a success or a weakness. You might say we've decentralized our motivations. All right, so final section, are there limits to decentralization? It's almost a parable of the decentralization movement that networks centralize for efficiency and decentralize for resilience. In the blockchain world, we talk about the scalability trilemma. So this is from the Ethereum wiki. And these are things that when designing a blockchain, there are areas you have to make trade-offs within, almost like a cap theorem for blockchains. So you have decentralization, which you'll note has its own very specific definition here, which is that a node needs to run on a small, not very powerful computer. Scalability here, meaning that the network is able to process more transactions than any one node. And security is the amount of resources that an attacker has to have to threaten the network. And of course, decentralization is on this list, which means it's a stat that we could lower in order to improve these other qualities. And when we talk about scalability, it's like a blockchain catechism to compare it to the transactions per second of something like Visa. Visa processes 24,000 transactions per second. Another way to understand this statement is that Visa has dropped its decentralization stat to 0 to make trade-offs for scalability. What about manufacturing? Right now, despite how much we talk about decentralizing the network and application layer, how often do we consider the centralization of the manufacturing pipeline for computers, the supply chain, a much less buzzword kind of chain? So, for example, only 5 countries in the world really mine rare earth minerals. There are only 3 manufacturers of RAM. This graph shows the major manufacturers of RAM, and I think you'll notice that Samsung is 51% attacking it. We've already seen cases where natural disasters have caused price surges. So we saw RAM prices spike 8% and NAND flash memory prices spike 20% in the wake of 2011 earthquakes. And this is because Japan accounts for 35% of world flash memory production and 13% of RAM. Turning to rare earth metals, an even lower level of the stack, so to speak, you'll see that a kind of shocking 91% of the US's rare earth minerals come from China. So if there were ever to be a serious natural disaster in that part of the world, the effects would certainly be felt. And there is a movement called Decentralized Manufacturing, which overlaps with the maker and open source hardware communities. There are projects like LibreRouter, which is a mesh-first open source hardware project, and Raspberry Pi, things like 3D printers. But having spent considerable time in a manufacturing startup and as a former maintainer of an open source laser cutter, I can tell you that the tools available to open source hardware enthusiasts are nowhere near the precision and reliability that we really need to regularly make things like computers. And there are certainly centralizing factors to manufacturing in the form of factory startup costs. Building a new semiconductor fabrication plant is estimated at $3 to $4 billion, and that's on the low end. There's expertise centralization. So in the startup I used to work at, we made glasses, and we had this one machine, probably about the size of this table, that inserted a metal core into the temple of the glasses. And that's all it did. But the menu for it was only in Chinese. There was no English instruction manual available. They shipped so few of them to North America that they'd never had a need to write one. So that's a kind of centralization. And then there's the simple fact that resources are not evenly distributed on this earth. In the blockchain world, we have ASICs, which are application-specific integrated circuits. This is hardware made specifically for calculating hashes, for solving the proof-of-work puzzle. And it's for doing this one very specific thing efficiently. And so what we have here is this hardware made by only a small number of companies that significantly increases the expense of starting up a mining node. And then it also ends up being an impediment to protocol upgrades because it can only efficiently solve this one specific mining algorithm. All right, so final question. Can we decentralize the building of decentralized networks? A bit of a recursive question. I see specialization and centralization as tightly connected concepts. A technical expert is often or can become a central point of failure for a decentralized network. So let's look at some stats from GitHub. This is the Go implementation of Ethereum. We see 52% of commits coming from 1% of contributors, another 51% attack. This is a Lorenz curve of contributions to Geth. We have the Go implementation of ipfs with 41% of commits from 2% of contributors. And if we look at DAT, we see a similar thing with 82% of commits coming from 6% of contributors. And of course, I haven't systemically analyzed this. I suspect it's fairly common in all open source projects in the non-peer-to-peer world as well. And indeed, it may be kind of inevitable given the nature of skills like programming, maintaining network infrastructure. They're fairly specialized, and they also require a pretty significant amount of time commitment. So the perfect decentralization here, the scalability of everyone in the world becoming proficient enough in Golang to contribute to Geth may not be feasible, but more so, it may actually be dangerous. Because at what expense in terms of other specializations? To take this idea to its absurd conclusion of complete knowledge decentralization, we'd have everyone in the world knowledgeable enough about everything to contribute to it once, which is clearly ridiculous. Of course, there are things we can do to improve the new developer experience and to onboard new people to our communities, ease that ramp. Those things are very important, but there may be limits to what is really possible. So in conclusion, the main questions we've covered. Are there limits to decentralization, possibly in the train of manufacturing, the limits of human brains to hold information hours in the day, the distribution of matter on the surface of this earth? What is enough decentralization? Do we even want decentralization? And if so, which decentralization? Who and what is the decentralization we're building serving? And finally, what underlies all of this is the reality that there are so many decentralizations, but all of them may prove meaningless and risk becoming just ideological background noise unless we continually and thoughtfully examine them. So thank you. My name is Sarah. I don't actually hate decentralization, and I'm not sure if I have time to answer your questions.
Okay. No, we have a little bit of time. We are behind schedule, obviously, but and actually the caterer just showed up, so we'll be serving a vegetarian lunch for everyone. But they are a bit late too, so that while they're setting up, we can take a couple questions. So, okay. Actually, we'll do the thing where you ask the question and then you repeat the question for the live stream. Okay. Go ahead.
In your studying of decentralization, did you study any natural patterns or systems from the natural world that implemented as a practice?
I did read a little bit about network science, but I didn't find a way to, which includes things like social networks, disease patterns, but I didn't find a good way to include it in this presentation. I think it would be a great extension, though. Yeah. And the question was, did you study the natural world and decentralization of the natural world while you were putting together this presentation? Yeah.
Did you look at the terms distributed network versus decentralization and the sort of nuanced differences between those?
Yes, I did, and that's you know, kind of the diagram that everyone uses is often explaining that. I think that the differences between those terms and the different definitions between, and the question was for the live stream, did you look at the difference between the terms distributed and decentralized when you're researching the presentation? I'm going to take the one in the middle. The question about I read a bunch of articles. I could tweet a list of my sources, actually. I would. Oh, maybe when I'm less busy. I will tweet that too if I do. Let's take.
Intuitively, I would say we should try to decentralize almost everything that we use, but maybe, like, as I get older, I come to believe that it's maybe not the case.
So to add to your question, maybe you have an idea. What should we decentralize and what things shouldn't we decentralize? You think there's also
so the question was, are there things we should not try to decentralize in particular, and things that we should answer that question themselves, for example, software and self to that, and are things that I think applies. In terms of the human layer, I think that every organization has to make those trade-offs for themselves. So I'm no
in your research, did you any reason mobilize the hardware?
I mean, what would be a reasonable path? I think there's a lot of energy directed at that venture, but I think it's kind of still in its infancy, and it has. But I know people like you are working on Raspberry Pi. All right, great. Thanks, everybody.